We are back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us. If you're watching on the Plus or streaming live on Facebook, feel free to message us. I see a lot of people watching. Not too many questions there. But our guest this morning is John Harris with the Tennessee Firearms Association. So, John, it's interesting. Whenever a new president takes office, different reactions from gun owners. I remember several years back, as you may do, when President Barack Obama became president. I remember going out and doing a story. I think it was in Murfreesboro, one of the gun stores there. And it was before he took office, but in that period before the inauguration. And the lines out the door, and people were buying guns, fearing that, the president, when he came in, would pass these laws to take guns away. And then with the Republicans, not so much the case. I think people view it differently. And now you have Joe Biden in the presidency. And I see some people on Facebook saying, well, Joe Biden's going to do everything he can to take our guns away from us. Look, I don't care what any president says. They're not taking the guns away from everyone. Now, will they try to seek more limits? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, we've got a good history to predict what's likely to happen in the sentiment of the public. For example, in Tennessee, we passed a law, and federally there's a similar one, that since 1998, you have to have a background check performed by either the FBI or the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to buy a gun from a retail dealer. That started in 98. From 98 until 2007, TBI's data reports that the volume of sales between retail dealers and the public was about 300,000 guns a year. 2008, Obama gets elected. That number jumps up from 300,000 to about 500,000 guns a year. It stayed at that level all the way through his presidency and through the first 3 years of Trump's presidency. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, TBI reported that we exceeded that 500,000 threshold in the first 6 months of the year.
Wow.
My anticipation is, with Biden coming in, particularly with Harris, Kamala Harris, no relation, as vice president, and the radical that she is, and with Pelosi and Schumer in full control of Congress, that the feeding frenzy for guns and ammunition would have taken off by now if there was any out there to be bought or acquired.
Okay, so do you believe then that there will be on the agenda, and they haven't said as much at this point, some of the priorities, of course, are focusing on the pandemic, that there may be further limits coming from the federal level with the new administration?
Absolutely. I fully expect statutory increased pressure from Congress. I expect regulatory increased pressure from the Biden administration, which he can do by executive order. I expect both of those, and I expect that to ramp up substantially. And I think so do a number of other states, because Missouri, Texas, and other states are already filing bills just since November that would prohibit the enforcement by using state tax dollars or state law enforcement of any federal laws or regulations, not just what's on the books now, but anything that might be added. And I know for a fact that legislation has been drafted in Tennessee. It has not been filed yet, but I know it's been drafted.
Okay, and so give me your thoughts, because when it happened with President Obama, there may have been some action in that regard over those 8 years, but people still had their weapons all along those lines. What do you think is most likely? We both know it's absurd to say he's going to come and take guns away from everyone. That's just not happening. Anyone who says that's flat wrong. So what do you think is most likely where they're going to target? What do you think? What kind of restrictions?
Well, I'll give you, for example, Trump didn't really understand the Second Amendment issue. And so after the Las Vegas shooting and the bump stock, he came out with some stuff that angered a lot of gun owners. And then what happened was ATF, by regulation, redefined the bump stock from an accessory to a firearm in and of itself. And it is no firearm capabilities at all. It's nothing but a stock.
Right.
But they redefined it as a machine gun, which meant that any bump stock made after 1986, it wasn't registered prior to 86, was contraband and had to be surrendered by the owners. There have been other guns that ATF has administratively reclassified as having no sporting purpose or no legitimate recreational purpose. and have tried to then classify them as subject to the National Firearms Act. What that does is that forces registration of those guns and imposes a $200 transfer tax on those guns. And it doesn't even have to be a gun. It could be something like just the high capacity magazines. And so there's a lot of people that are concerned that, yeah, he might not be able to ban them, but that's exactly what Trump did with the bump stocks, and it was effective, and no lawsuit stopped it. But that Biden and Harris, Pelosi and Schumer could either through Congress or the ATF regulatory mechanisms take classes of guns, AR-15s, for example, or high capacity magazines or other weapons that have, quote, no sporting purpose, and move them from what's called a class, a 68 Gun Control Act weapon, what you typically see, in used to a Walmart, and make them subject to the National Firearms Act from 1934, which is a much higher grade of regulation. And also all of those guns would have to be registered, or those items registered with the ATF.
All right, I guess it'll be wait and see on that front. In general, I mean, is there any form of regulation, or as you see some of what we see going on in our society these days and some of these protests and the rallies and the concerns sometimes when some individuals are showing up with weapons, many of whom I think probably own them legally. I mean, as you observe these types of things and you wonder about conflict if it happens with law enforcement or whatever security is there, where do you think that's going? Will it escalate, with more of the arming? Everyone has a right to personal security. What do you think?
I don't think it'll really escalate. If you compare, for example, in 2020, there was a whole lot of focus on Virginia and the fact that Virginia's government and their governor were changing the gun laws, and much as we expect Biden's administration to do. And there were massive turnouts and protests at the Virginia Capitol with people openly carrying weapons and openly carrying AR-15s and long arms. And there were no adverse violence at all. It was just a show of force. And contrast that with what and those are probably, the conservative right or the supporters of the conservative right. And contrast that with the riots and the protests, or whatever you want to call them, that you see from primarily the supporters of the progressive left that's in Portland, Oregon, and Chicago and Detroit and these other areas. It's not the conservative right, and they're the ones that are in fear of Biden at this point. That's the risk for an armed protest becoming violent. It's the progressive left and the Democrats historically that have that element in their political, tent, and they're the ones that are supporting Biden at this point.
Yeah, well, you have to concede, though, a few weeks back at the U.S. Capitol, that wasn't the progressive left.
Well, no, I don't concede that, because I've talked to a number of people, including people that were there that day, and there is a lot of belief and sentiment from people that were there on the ground that the people that were supporting Trump were in a particular group and area far away from the Capitol, and there was a second group that coalesced, are the ones that rushed the Capitol, according to these observers, and that those were not the Trump conservative right. They were there just like what you see in Portland, Oregon, and they were there to masquerade as if they were conservatives, but to create turmoil and rush.
Okay, well, as it is, we'll see. With regard to here in the state of Tennessee, then, do you expect anything to be passed early this session?
No, I don't really expect much early this session. We're getting off to a slow start because Governor Lee called this special education session. They won't start on the regular agenda until probably February at the earliest. And then the typical system, they can pass special session laws in a matter of days. If we come back in regular session in February, it's going to be probably April or May before they actually start passing the kinds of laws that we focus on. So I don't expect it to be quick. I do expect us to make some progress, but I don't expect it to be quick. And
just with regard to the Second Amendment and its strength and the fact that it remains, I mean, do you ever worry that the Second Amendment would be overturned?
Now, the Second Amendment is ingrained in the Constitution, and as a constitutional matter, it's a huge hurdle to amend the Constitution to take something out once it's in there. Now, that's a separate issue from having a packed Supreme Court or the wrong people on the Supreme Court, interpreting the Second Amendment in ways that are totally inappropriate and not what the founders intended. I do see that as a huge risk. I do see as a huge risk Congress passing laws that then have to be challenged through the courts to have them declared unconstitutional, which is what happened in the Heller and the McDonald cases from 2008 and 2010. But that's a long, hard process. But I don't see the Second Amendment itself going away.
I agree with you on that 100%. John, listen, thank you so much for coming on, my friend. We'll talk again soon, all right?
I enjoyed it.
All right, take care.
Thank
We'll be
you.
in touch. Let's take a break. When we come back, programming notes coming up right after this. Stay with us.